One or two. He walked the same route every night after work, hands buried in his jacket pockets, head down against the cold. The street was usually empty at that hour, just the dull hum of distant traffic and the occasional dog barking from behind rusted fences. He liked the quiet. It calmed him after the long hours spent lifting crates in the warehouse, his back aching and his fingers stiff. But that night the quiet felt wrong. Too still, too tense, as if the city was holding its breath. His steps slowed when he heard something, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. A broken gasp, a whimper. He turned his head, eyes narrowing into the shadows near the alley wall. At first, he saw only movement, something slumped, something barely breathing. He stepped closer, careful, like approaching a wounded animal that might bite out of fear. And then he saw her, a woman, a police officer, her uniform torn, her badge smeared with dirt and blood. The street lamp flickered above her, and the weak light made her skin look ghostly pale. Her hair was matted to her forehead, and her lips trembled as she struggled to breathe. One hand pressed desperately against her side, as if trying to hold herself together. He froze. He had been taught, by life, by his neighborhood, by the way officers looked at him, to stay away. If police found a black man near a dying officer, nobody would ask questions. They would shoot first. Headlines would write the rest. And yet, she looked up at him, not with suspicion, not with judgment, just fear. Real human fear. And pain, please, she whispered, barely audible. Something inside him clenched. He knelt beside her despite the alarm in his head screaming, "Walk away." Her blood was warm and sticky against his hands as he tried to steady her. She blinked slowly, her eyes struggling to stay open. When she spoke again, her voice was strained, like each word cost her something she didn't have. "They did this," she breathed. Her voice cracked, her head slumped forward, and he had to catch her before she fell completely. He looked up and down the street. Empty. No headlights. No pedestrians. No help. If he called 911, whoever had done this might find her first, might finish what they started. And even if rescue came, would they believe him? A man alone, covered in blood, that wasn't his? His heart hammered. He didn't know this woman. He didn't owe her anything. But leaving her there felt like letting the world rot even more. So he lifted her, carefully, as though she were made of glass. She groaned in pain, her head weakly resting against his shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure it was. "I've got you." He carried her to his car, every step heavy with fear. And as he drove into the dark city, streetlights sliding past like ghostly witnesses, he realized something. Whatever he had just stepped into, there would be no going back. He kicked the apartment door closed behind him, the hinges rattling as if the building itself protested the intrusion of danger. The place was small, a narrow living room, a single couch, a kitchenette hardly bigger than a closet. It wasn't meant for emergencies, certainly not for bleeding strangers. But it was all he had. He lowered her carefully onto the couch, her breath hitching in pain as he did. For a second he just stared at her, unsure, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He had watched enough medical videos online, enough shows, enough life to know what bleeding looked like when it was bad. This was worse. He dug through drawers and cabinets, pulling out a half-filled bottle of rubbing alcohol, a roll of gauze he had from when he cut his hand at work, and a clean old t-shirt he didn't mind destroying. He knelt beside her, swallowing hard. When the alcohol touched the wound, she jerked and a hoarse, broken sound escaped her. He paused, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, even though the apology felt too small. "You're doing fine," she breathed, eyes half open, watching him through pain-glazed confusion. Her voice carried strength beneath the pain. That struck him. She was fading, but her presence felt grounded, solid. He cleaned as gently as he could, pressing cloth to her wound, feeling his own heartbeat spiking, matching the rhythm of her rapid breathing. Minutes stretched long and tense. When the worst of the bleeding slowed and the bandage was secured, she sagged back into the couch, exhausted. The dim lamp cast both of them in a warm, muted gold. She blinked, taking in her surroundings. His worn-out sneakers by the door, the cracked mug on the table, the mismatched chairs. Nothing said wealth or comfort, but everything was clean, lived in, real. "You could have left me," she murmured, voice low, rough. He sat back against the wall, legs stretched out, chest still rising fast. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Her eyes softened, not with pity, but something like understanding. Something like respect. She tried to speak again, but her voice caught on emotion more than pain this time. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and when she opened them, the truth spilled out in fragments. She had been working on a case, internal affairs level, corruption that ran deep, tangled through ranks she once trusted. She uncovered proof, payments, witness threats, disappearances. And when she reported it, the ones who smiled in the same briefing room turned on her. They hunted her like prey. As she spoke, his stomach twisted. He had grown up believing the world was unfair, but hearing her confirm it, someone from the very system that judged him without knowing him, felt surreal, wrong, terrifying. "So you ran," he said softly. "I fought," she corrected, voice firm despite her exhaustion. "And I survived, just barely." Silence grew between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. They were from opposite sides of a line drawn long before either of them was born. But in that moment the line blurred. There was no cop and civilian, no uniform and street clothes, just two people who had both been failed by something bigger than themselves. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, too far to mean safety, too close to ignore. They both listened. Her hand tightened into a fist. His jaw clenched. Trouble was coming, and neither of them could face it alone now. The first hint of danger wasn't the sound. It was the silence. The city outside had a rhythm. Distant cars, voices, the hum of life. But suddenly, everything went still, as if the world were holding its breath again. He was sitting by the door, half dozing, when the faint creak of a stairboard snapped his senses awake. Not the normal groan of the old building settling. Something deliberate, weight, movement. He looked at her. She was already awake, eyes sharp despite the pain, fingers inching toward the pistol he'd placed on the table earlier. No words were needed. The fear between them was shared, electric. The footsteps grew clearer, slow, confident. Whoever was coming wasn't rushing. They weren't unsure. They knew exactly where they were going. He felt his pulse quicken, thudding in his throat. He had never held a gun before tonight, never fired one. He hadn't asked for any of this, but he knew one thing with certainty. If the people coming through that door reached her, she would die. And he might disappear without a name or a story. Just another headline nobody questioned. The doorknob twitched. She motioned silently. "Get low." He slid behind the small dining table, body pressed tight against the floor, breath trapped in his lungs. She moved with more strength than she should have had left, using the couch for cover. Pistol trembling in her hand, but her eyes steady and focused. The door burst open in a violent explosion of wood and metal. 3 men. No uniforms, no badges. Their faces hardened, practiced. Killers, not officers, not anymore. One swept his gaze over the room, lips curling into a grim satisfaction. "She didn't get far," he muttered. The first shot rang out, deafening in the small space. Wood splintered inches from his face. His ears buzzed, disoriented, heat rushing up his spine. He grabbed the gun she had given him, hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. But when he saw her grit her teeth and fire back, teeth bared against the pain, something inside him steadied. He exhaled and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his arm like a hammer. The shot went wild, hitting the wall, but it startled the nearest man enough for her to hit him clean in the shoulder. He fell back, shouting. Chaos erupted, gunfire flashing like lightning in a storm. The apartment filled with smoke and dust. He fired again, and this time the shot landed, catching one of the attackers in the leg. The man crumpled with a howl. She moved with sharp, trained precision, even weakened. Her final shot struck the last attacker in the chest, sending him crashing backward onto the floorboards. And then silence returned, thick and buzzing. He could feel his heartbeat everywhere, in his fingers, in his teeth, in his throat. She slid down to the floor, breath ragged, body shaking. He scrambled to her side, catching her before she collapsed fully. Her eyes flickered up to him, full of a fierce, exhausted gratitude. "You didn't run," she whispered, voice thin. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening, steadying her. "Neither did you." Days later, when the story broke, when the world saw arrests made live on news channels, when the chief was led out in handcuffs, when officers who once walked proudly now bowed their heads in disgrace, she stood before the cameras, pale but unbroken. Reporters shouted her name. Flashes burst like stars, but she didn't speak about heroism or survival. She spoke about him, the man who no one expected to protect a cop, the stranger who risked his life without hesitation, the one who chose humanity over fear. And when he stepped into view beside, 2-2, her, awkward, quiet, unsure, people didn't gasp because he was black and she was a police officer. They gasped because the world had decided long ago that people like them were meant to stand on opposite sides, but they didn't. They stood together, and that changed everything.